Good morning. Again, it is good to be able to spend some time studying God's Word with you this morning. I know the times are difficult. Times are getting better. I know we're able to get out more as of this weekend, and I'm glad for that. But continue to be wise about what you do. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Ten Commandments. And I like this picture of Charlton Heston. It's the best thing I could find. Because lots of times we have a perspective of something that we've studied a lot or thought a lot about. And this is kind of an image that we often think of with respect to the Ten Commandments. We've seen the movie, most of us, I'm sure. And we think about what we saw there. And we tie what we know about the Ten Commandments to things like this. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time connecting the Ten Commandments back to Jesus and considering how it impacts us. And so let's go on. So today, I want to do a little bit of a review. We're going to run through the first part of Exodus. So we've seen that the Israelites went down to Egypt. Pharaoh started to kill the children, and Moses was born during that time. Pharaoh's daughter rescues him, draws him out of the water. And then Moses, as he grows older, trying to rescue his brothers, kills an Egyptian. And then we see a story where Moses rescues somebody at a water well, like we've seen in many other stories earlier in the Bible. And then the Israelites are crying out for help as he's off in the wilderness. And God calls Moses from a burning bush. He goes and tells Pharaoh. He goes and tells the Israelites. And things don't get better immediately. We've got a God. He's going to rescue us. Things are going to get better, but they don't. And then the plagues. The water is turned to blood. The frogs come, and then the gnats and the flies. The livestock die, and we have a plague of boils. And then the hail comes and destroys all the food, and then the locusts come and destroy even more food, and then the darkness comes that's felt. It's so dark that it's felt. And then Yahweh gives the instructions for the Passover, and the death of the firstborn frees the Israelites that they can leave Egypt. And then Pharaoh pursues them. And Pharaoh and his men, they die in the Red Sea as the Israelites cross. And then we see them giving thanksgiving. And then a few days later, in fact, it's 3 days in Exodus chapter 15, we see that 3 days after this great event, they start complaining, and there's bitter water. And God solves the problem. There's bitter water. God, why did you do this? Why did you bring us out into this land to die? 3 days after they crossed the Red Sea. Another few weeks pass by, about a month and a half pass by, and we see them complaining about not having food. And so another month and a half pass by, and they complain more. And then sometime later, they complain and say, why did you bring us out of Egypt to die again? Because they have no water. And you may not be able to see that, but basically they have no water. And so God provides them water, even though they're complaining. And, so many times as a father, I look at things like this and I say, God is so much more patient than I am. My children whine to me and I say, you have to say that a little different way, because I'm not going to give you what you ask for when you whine. But God actually is often a little bit more merciful, a lot more merciful with me than I may be with my children. But God provides water. So 3 times we see them complain about what God hasn't done, almost forgetting what He has done for them. And then Moses' father-in-law comes down and gives him some advice about how to judge the people. And then we arrive at Mount Sinai, where we'll receive the 10 Commandments. And this is where we're going to spend our time this morning, discussing the 10 Commandments and how that's given, and specifically how it's given, not as much about what is given, but how it's given. And so let's go and have a prayer real quick, and then we'll continue with our lesson. Dear God, we thank you. Thank you for what you've written down in your word for us to know, so that we'd know what you expect of us, so that we would know what we can obey, so that we would know the rewards that you have in store for us. Grant us wisdom so that we may remember what you've done, obey what you've told us to do, and to look forward to that reward that you have before us. You are an awesome God, and we thank you for your kindness and your care for us. Please be with us as we have this study, and be with those who are sick, and we ask that you alleviate the stress of life that we have right now with the coronavirus, and grant us wisdom as things lighten up, that we may be able to spend time together, and grant the elders wisdom as they make decisions and consider how to move forward. We pray all this in your Son, Jesus Christ's name. Amen. So this is a picture of a place that would have been, could have been Mount Sinai that we reference in the Bible. There's a few different places. This is a nice picture of that. So let's go to Exodus chapter 19 and start reading and see what God has to tell us in this chapter. On the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you up on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. And now therefore you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandment, and you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples of all the earth. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever." That they may hear when I speak to you, and believe you forever. I'll come back and address some of these things that I've highlighted, but I want to highlight them as we go. When Moses told the words to of the people to the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, 'Take care not to go up into the mountain, or to touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain.' So Moses went So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, "Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman." On the morning of the third day, there were thunders, lightnings, and thick cloud around the mountain, a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. And the Lord came down on the Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord, and look, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." And Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourselves warned us, saying, 'Set limits around the mountain and consecrate it.' And the Lord said to him, 'Go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through and come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them.' So Moses went down to the people and told them." It's interesting, again, like I said, it's kind of like Moses is getting a workout. He's going up the mountain, he's coming down the mountain. He's going up the mountain, he's going down the mountain. He's going to talk to God. God's going to give him a message. He goes down to the people and tells them what the message was. He hears what the people say. He goes back to God. He goes from God to the people and people to God. But at the beginning of this, he points out, God says that he's going to make a covenant with them. And that he describes this process as, "I've rescued you. You know what I've done. I rescued you. And now you will obey my voice. I'm going to give you a covenant and you're going to keep it. And when you keep it, you will be my treasured possession among all the peoples from all the earth. Among all of them, you are my treasured possession." And this is kind of a pattern that God rescues. God expects that we obey him. Not that we do it to earn what he's done, but because he's done it, we obey him. And then there's a reward. And here we see that we will be his treasured possession, his kingdom. And there's more blessings that come later on where God describes how he will bless people. But we will be, these people will be priests to them, a holy nation. And this recalls to my mind, and it does in reverse whenever I'm reading in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks about the church in the same way. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Technology just failed me. There we go. I want to give y'all a real experience like I'm normally here, like we're normally here. So technology failed me once again. Anyway, but God delivers his people, then he expects us to obey, and then he shows us what the rewards will be. And at the end of this, we see in verse 8 that the people agree. And they say, "We will do everything that the Lord has said." And it's interesting as we go back, think about what we just discussed as I went through those slides showing all that's happened. And Israel, 3 days after they crossed the Red Sea, what do? Well, they whine to God and say, "We don't have good water." I was like, why can't you just ask God and say, God, this water's bad? But they immediately whine to God. And then they beg God for food rather than asking God for food. And then they complain to God about not having enough water, and complain, why don't we just go back? And why not ask God just to give it rather than complaining to Him? And we see that kind of attitude, and here they are saying, we'll do anything that the Lord says. We'll do everything that He says. And then we'll see in another 40 days or so that they're breaking the first laws that God gives them. It doesn't take long for man to forget. And I don't want to just call out the Israelites for this, but man is like this. We often forget quickly the good things that have happened, and who has done it for us. Notice also that how God presents Himself. When He presents Himself to the people, He presents Himself in thunder, in lightning. There we go in verse 16. Presents Himself in thunder and lightning and a thick cloud and a great trumpet blast. And how terrifying would this be, to be in the middle of basically nowhere, and you see fire come down from heaven, you see a cloud surrounding a mountain, you see lightning and thunder, and you hear that, and then this trumpet blast, this great trumpet blast. And you know that's your God. I can imagine how I would feel. Can you imagine how you would feel in that situation? And why? The penalty for coming near God is death. And when we consider this, and I think I need to step back for just a second. When we consider what's happening here, it's hard for us a lot of times to look at God in this way, because we think of God as, oftentimes we think of God as speaking with a gentle voice, speaking gently. We think maybe of Elijah and how God's not in the thunder, God's not in the earthquake, God's not in this. He's in the still small voice. But there's a reason that God presents Himself in this way. There's a reason that God makes the penalty of approaching the mountain death. Because these people need to learn to fear God and who He is, and understand who He is and the power that He has over life and death, and that this is an important moment, not just to make lightly of what's happening. So God presents Himself in this way, and so consider this. I mean, and I just want you to ask this. This is obviously a rhetorical question, but why is it that God presents Himself in this way? And He answers that in the next chapter, and I'll break it down for you real quick. But Exodus chapter 20, verse 18 through 21 says, "The people trembled with fear. Do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses replies, "Don't be afraid. God has come to test you, that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning." I mean, that's the point of this, is of God coming like this, is so that the people know who God is and have a fear of Him. And it's interesting to me, and we'll look at it again, but that Moses at first says, "Don't be afraid." God is doing this so that you know how to fear God, that you fear God. That fear does motivate you to a certain degree. That it motivates you to not do the thing that you're going to do in another 12 chapters when you build an idol. That fear, this thunder, this lightning, this terrible sound, this should teach you not to do the bad thing that you're thinking about doing, because God is powerful. And you have seen all that He has done. You saw how He brought you out of Egypt. You should have some fear with respect to God. But again, he says, don't be afraid. And I think that's interesting, that those who trust in God, who see what he's doing, who understand how mighty and powerful he is, we don't have to be afraid because we have fear of God and understand that he is all-powerful and capable of taking not only our life, but to destroy our soul. Let's move on to next chapter, chapter 20. So, an interesting thing, when I think about this, I've always thought about Moses received the Ten Commandments. But who heard God give these 10 commandments? Specifically the 10 commandments. I'm not sure about what follows, but right here, the 10 commandments. Who gets to hear God give these 10 commandments? Well, when we look back at what we just read, Exodus chapter 19, verse 9, it says, "Behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear me speak with you, and that they may also believe in you." And so God's going to tell Moses in every hearing that he's going to tell him the 10 commandments. He's going to tell Moses in everyone's hearing. So when Moses goes back and says, "This is what the Lord says," they will know for certain that Moses is telling the truth. They have witnessed it themselves, and they know exactly what the law is that they have to follow, these 10 commandments. And that they may believe you for how long? For a week, for 2 days, for 40 days, for a year, no, forever. So this is heard in everyone's hearing, so that all of us may know, not just Moses handing it down, but that everyone, the leaders of the people, down to the children who will actually go into the promised land, because the adults are not going to get to go in. So everyone gets to hear God deliver the 10 commandments. And that, to me, that's kind of exciting. That this is not a message to be hidden, but this is a message for everyone. I think it's important for us to note that this is a message for everyone, that the whole congregation of the people gets to hear this message. Let's read Exodus chapter 20. We'll just read through the first 17 verses. "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And you shall have no other gods before me." I'm going to go one by one as we do this. So, I am the Lord. And remember, the Lord is not his name. Yahweh is his name. And so when we see Lord there, it's I don't know the term. I think Larry said it's tetragrammaton. But I am the Lord, Yahweh, your God, and there are no other gods before me. That means I'm coming down to be in your presence. I'm going to be in the presence of Israel, and I don't want any other gods in my presence, which means in your presence. You don't need to have any other gods. This is number one. "And you shall not make for yourselves a carved image in the likeness of anything that is in heaven above, on the earth beneath, in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." And the point of this isn't so much these carved images, because later on God talks about making specific carved images. It's not just carved images, it's about carved images that you're bowing down to. Don't make an image even of God. Don't make an image of something to put above me. Do not make an image for these purposes. So that's number two. And then it says, "Do not," verse 7, "you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And this is an interesting thing here, to think about what it means to take something. To take the Lord's name. That doesn't just mean, so many times we think of taking the Lord's name as just saying God or Jesus or Christ or Lord as an explicative, as a way, of people saying that with disregard to God and in a way that doesn't even really make sense if you know what those words are about. But also, in a sense, we need to consider taking the name. These people are being made His people. So God's name is going to go with these people wherever they go. So when they walk around and they do whatever they do, if they associate with another God, they are doing something to the name of the Lord. They are taking His name with them in a vain way. And we need to think about it that way as well. Still, our language should match this, but also our walk and our talk, everything that we do, points back to who is our God? Who is our God? We shall not take the Lord's name in vain. And that's number 3. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The 6 days you labor and do all your work. But on the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Jesus taught about this and said that the man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. Now, I'll come back to the Sabbath in a little bit, but so many of these things, sometimes we make it less important than it should be. And like I said, I'll come back to this. Next, verse 12, honor your father and mother that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and here that you may live long in the land. And these first 5 commandments, this is number 5, kind of point to God. And it's interesting to me that at least that's how people group them. This 5th one is kind of in between, because who is our Father? God is our Father. So in the same way, we need to remember that we need to honor our Father God as well as our parents. And the way we treat any authority over us kind of points back to God and how we treat God. We trust that God is going to look out for us. And because God put governments in place, we submit to them. And because He gave us the parents that He gave us, we submit to them as well. And it goes down the line. But many people point this back to grouping it with God, and we'll talk about that again in a little bit. The next 5 are pretty short. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. And all of these are really kind of dealing with people, but when we read these, think about what Jesus says in the same vein. Jesus says, you shall not murder. That's what you've heard. But don't even hate someone, because in the end, you've murdered them in your heart. It says, you shall not commit adultery, but don't even look at a woman with lust, because that is just as bad. That is, you have already committed adultery with her in your heart. And it doesn't directly say this, but in a sense, when you covet someone else's stuff, someone else's things, it's like you've already stole it. When you desire someone else's and imagining what it would be like for it to be yours and desiring it in such a way that it changes how you act, it's like you've already stole it. God does not like false witness in any way. All of these things, it's really difficult not to be with you because I want to ask a lot of questions and I can't do that right now. But let's continue on. And the people's response to this is important. Now all the people saw the thunder, and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off. And Moses said to Moses, "You speak to us, we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, and that you may not sin." And the people stood far off, and Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And notice that contrast. So number one, the people, again, we talked about this earlier, the people are afraid, and they say, "You speak to him, because if we speak to him, we'll die." And that's true. They can't come near to him like Moses can. Moses doesn't approach God with fear. He approaches him with confidence because God has given reason for that confidence. He's entrusted him, and he has done all of these things for him. And Moses has faith in God, and he trusts him, and God has called him to this. But I think it's interesting, the contrast. The people stood far off, and Moses draws near. Imagine if you were watching this and you saw Moses go up to the mountain and he enters into this cloud, into the fire, and into this. And how terrifying would that be to see the man who is your leader go into this? This God is powerful. So the Ten Commandments, really, in a lot of ways, when it comes down to it, this is the whole of really what God has people to live by. Everything that follows kind of points back to this, tells people how you can serve God, how you worship God, what an altar looks like, what the tent of meeting looks like. It describes all of these different things in very specific detail, but everything can be boiled down to the Ten Commandments. When we try to simplify it, we don't need to really make it much simpler except for what Jesus did. When Jesus talks about this, when he talks about the Ten Commandments or about what's the greatest commandment, he really wraps it up into two specific commandments. And these also come from the Old Testament. Let us never think that the Old Testament being old and not the current covenant doesn't have value. Pretty much everything that we get in the New Testament has its origin in the Old Testament. It has its origin in the Old Testament and maybe even the language of the Old Testament. Matthew chapter 22, verse 34 through 39 says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.'" So these are the two commandments, to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that really sums up the Ten Commandments, doesn't it? Love God, put him not only as first, but put him as everything. Do what he says. He is the one God, the true God. Have no other gods. Don't be slack about how you handle his name. Treat his name with reverence. All of these things summed up in love God, obey him. How do we obey God, or how do we love God? I just answered that. John tells us, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And that's what Jesus says. And that's what this means. If we love God, we will keep his commandments. We will follow these things. The second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. If we love our neighbor, we're not going to murder, we're not going to steal, we're not going to commit adultery. All of these things we will not do because we are loving God and we are loving our neighbor. So, we're not under the old law. However, which one of these are we going to exclude? Which one of these commandments would we not follow? We need to make God our only God. We need to not allow anything to get between us and God. Anything that we do, any creative thing that we do, we don't need to let that get in the way of our relationship to God. We need to make sure that we're walking in His ways. And, okay, so the Sabbath day. How do we deal with the Sabbath day? Well, God said they needed a break. God's pretty wise. So maybe we need to consider that as well. So many times we kind of put that off. I know I have. And I'm not saying that we need to follow the old law, but there's a lot of good in what is done here, what is said here. And if anything we would cut out, it kind of is this. What else would we not do? All of the rest of these make sense. So let's consider all of them and give them the honor of God's word that we should, and consider them and how they should impact our lives. But truly, the lesson that I want to share with you today, as we end this, how does this apply to me? It's the Old Testament. How does this apply to me? How does this apply to us? God comes and He delivers to the Israelites a plan. I've delivered you from Egypt. Well, God delivered the Israelites from Egypt. He's delivered you and I from sin. God made known His expectations to the Israelites here. He told them who He was. He told them what He expects of them. He told them His laws. He's given us His word. We have today words that were spoken around 4,000 years ago. How amazing is that? And He has given us His word. So He gave the Israelites His word. He gives us His word. And He has an expectation of us that we obey Him. And the obedience, so if God's gonna fulfill His covenant, and He always does, God will give rewards. And it's not just because we obey, because He's gonna give rewards. But He expects those who love Him to obey Him. We show Him respect. You don't disobey someone that you show respect to. You don't disobey someone that you love, who is over you. You don't disregard what they teach, because you love them. And so the expectation is that we obey God, and promises will come. His promises will be fulfilled. His reward is set before us, just like Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. The reward set before Him, He obeyed even to death. And we can do the same. And we need to learn that, as Christians, it's so hard for us to say that we need to fear the Lord. But there is a degree to which that's true, that we need to understand, who is God? What power does He have over my life? He holds the very thread of my life in His hands. He gives me the very breath that I breathe. I need to trust Him, that not only can He shake mountains, but He can shake my very life. We need to fear God. And not just, I know we often talk about it as respect, but just know that God is powerful. And when we truly understand who God is, and we fear Him and obey Him, the fear will be something that we know, but we can get close to Him, and we don't have to be afraid anymore. Just like Moses, who was able to stand in God's presence. And this is really what grace is like. God has given a gift. Israel didn't deserve this. God gave them a gift. And now He has some expectations of them. You need to obey me. And if you don't, He'll tell us about it later on, but if you don't obey me, I'm going to destroy your land. I'm going to kick you out, and everything's going to change. You're not going to get these promises that I've made to you if you don't keep my promise and keep my commandments. I want to finish with some words that I think are, God puts it best, how we should live with respect to all this. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 15. Hear, O Israel, The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and the vineyard and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, and then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you. For the Lord your God is in your midst, is a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth. This is the expectation that God gives his people. And we need to remember that there is reason to fear God. There is reason to fear God. But he is also great and blesses his people and gives them rewards. Rewards they didn't deserve. He says, reminds them, when you come into the good stuff, remember me. Because who got you here? Today, when you think about the good things, when you count your blessings, remember who gave them to you. James tells us every good and perfect gift comes from God. And we need to remember that. So this is what I want to end with today, to remember that God's rescued us. God has made his expectations known. He wants us to obey him. And with obedience will come the rewards. So let's trust in him. Let's fear him. Let's love him and walk in his ways.